Hey everyone.
Hello, everyone. Just give another 30 seconds and we start. Okay, let's start. Hello, everyone. Today is Friday, February 6th, and we are in the Bandit Context Working Group. So the agenda is same as we had yesterday, just for allowing people in different time zone to sing in. So we have introduced a bit more kind of color coding in the spreadsheet to understand like things that are ignored or shared. I can see that the progress are 41%. I think there's like a slowdown on the kind of categorization. It's probably understandable because there's like a lot of aspects that are not as black and white to classify as expected. And so I think we need to find a way um, to move forward at least, or like maybe create some kind of discussion, side discussions about we have these kind of aspects. Should projects and group go into the I think we have like a groups and projects feature category, but should that be like a separate bounded context that deals in general with this kind of projects and groups as containers? There's a lot of other aspects that I think still need to be classified. But in general, what we want is to have a list of feature categories that are used, and we have like a pretty good coverage, pretty much. We didn't have to get to 100% necessarily, but at least as long as we have like a good coverage. Um, yeah, in terms of next steps, and so I was thinking, how do we move forward from having, a list of feature categories to, potentially see, the code namespaced better, like better organized in bounded context. So, and I think here is we need to kind of make the leap between choosing the feature categories that some part of the code relates to what is the actual Ruby namespace we should be using there. Like, should we just reuse the same existing Ruby namespace that is there today, which is might be totally fine, or should the things need to be combined together? Now, what we can see is there could be some different paths that are related to the same feature category, but we might use slightly different namespaces. In some cases, maybe we want to keep those as separate. In some cases, we want to join them. We have scenarios of the namespaces are very similar, just like a slightly different wording, but they're actually very similar. It's just like maybe that we chose to do slightly different things, and they should be merged together. Some other scenarios, they actually represent two sub features, and we might want to keep them separate. So I think there is like to move from there to the Ruby namespace will be, in my opinion, the next path forward. I'm wondering like what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I have a general question. Like, how are we thinking about model files? Would that be something that would be also namespaced, or would we have model files always be kind of the shared between all of the different namespaces?
So you mean like how do we organize Ruby namespaces?
Yeah, like for example, if we think about the user model,
Mhm.
many different features have code inside the models. So it's not really owned by one specific team. how are we thinking about assigning ownership to that, for example?
Yeah, yes, it's a good question. So we do have we have documentation about certain classes that are currently classified as God classes or omniscient classes.
Okay.
I'll find a link in our docs we have. But the okay, software design guides, and we have it here. So I think there the principle is that these kind of classes are like full of responsibilities, and in the future, and we just put that here at the end. So I think what we want to do in the long term is take responsibilities out of these classes, either invert responsibilities. So there is no need for user to have relationship with everything in the in the code base. So instead of saying what are the merge requests created by this user, so instead of saying user.merge request, for example, we could do we we go to the merge request bounded context and say, give me the merge request for this user ID, for example. So this kind of way of inverting the dependency might actually allow the say we keep the merge request related code and responsibilities within the merge request bounded context, and we actually remove this responsibility from the user. I think I know it's like a simplified approach. There'll be a little bit more complicated examples there that might be not as black and white, but I've seen this principle could be used in a lot of things. I've experimented with projects, with groups, and with user as well to try to do some kind of refactorings, and in some cases they actually work well. They haven't been committed because they actually represent like a much larger change in terms of way of working, but it's possible. So I think if we don't have to try to refactor user entirely, but I think if we make user in the long term the more like the identity model, and not so much about the behavior and the responsibilities that the user itself has, then I think it will be a lot easier to say, okay, the user maybe is owned by an authorization team, for example. I'm just making up, but like I'm saying, like it will be a lot simpler than to say, okay, user are managed by the authorization and team, for example. But then all the various responsibilities are scattered across different namespaces and different bounded context.
Yeah,
Does
that
that
makes a lot.
answer?
Yeah, for sure. Thank
Okay.
you so much. I also wanted to share, I don't know if this was brought up in any of the issues or MRs, but I'm quickly going to share my screen. In the search team, we decided a while ago to define a Rubicop rule to prevent us from making classes that are not under the search namespace. And this has made it really easy for us to kind of move away from defining things in random places. So I think something like this could be useful to, once we start thinking about how do we enforce this, I think this was a really good way for us to kind of move towards having everything namespace together. So
Yes, that's great. Actually, I wasn't not aware of that, so this is good to know. Yeah, so I think what we would like to do eventually is, as we come up with a list of namespaces, we can extend that to Rubocop class to say, hey, your namespace doesn't match any of the currently registered namespaces. It doesn't mean it has to be like a fixed list. This obviously can change over time. We can have, we can add a new bounded context, new namespaces there. And we can have like a process for adding and removing or merging things. But ultimately, I think we want to use something like that as a Rubocop
nice.
to kind of help developers to choose. Sometimes it's like they don't want to have too much thinking about what to choose, and you just choose whatever makes more sense or is already there in the list. Yeah, that's great to know.
Yeah, I'll continue talking. So I see we added a new column in the sheet for the Ruby namespace suggested bounded context. Is that something that you want each team to also start to fill in?
Yeah, so I think this is more like, since it's a working group, I would like us to all together to make like this kind of decisions. Um, but in my opinion, I think this will be like a nice transition from working on feature categories, since it's like it was feature categories are good to understand. Are all these different namespaces related to the same thing, to the same feature? So I think it's this kind of data point, I think is important. This is why like originally, we started this working group with working with feature categories. Having the bounded context on the side, I think is like, how do we translate this
Yes.
into which namespace we translate? And there we can see another side of the data point, which is, are these two things related to the same feature category, but we are purposely choosing to put them into different namespaces? And it will be interesting to understand the why of this, since there could be pattern that could be used across the organization, or maybe those are special cases. I think it's also part of this working group is to understand how we work as engineers and what design decisions we make, and make those explicit. um, so I think it's interesting there. It will be interesting exercise to see, okay, maybe there's a one-on-one match between feature category and the namespace we decide. Maybe most of the cases will be like that. In some cases, we might have one single namespace with multiple feature categories inside, or maybe the other way around.
Mm.
Um, it will be interesting to see like how the two relate, because um, so in our definition of bounded context as part of the architecture blueprint, we don't have a very strict definition. We say, okay, we start with feature category as a guideline, but then that needs to be refined, on
Yeah.
case by case. Which is exactly what I think we are doing with this exercise. We started with the feature category, but we refine it on a case by case with the Ruby namespace, and we see there like what the final result is.
That makes
But yeah,
sense.
I welcome any kind of feedback, whether this makes sense or doesn't make sense, or makes sense in certain scenarios or not.
Yeah, I think maybe if we don't have any other topics to talk about, we can go through like an exercise of, so for example, I'm in search and I was thinking that search could be a Ruby namespace because it relates to kind of a business function and
Mhm.
what a user would perform. But then I was also wondering, okay, we also have different external dependencies, like we use Elasticsearch, which is an external service. So do we split it according to external services as a namespace, or
Mhm.
the more the business function of what is the user doing, the user searching? Um,
Okay,
that was
yeah, it's interesting. Unless like anybody else has anything else to bring, I think I'll be interested in diving into that.
cool.
Um, so when you say that Elasticsearch, I know we have the Elasticsearch as a kind of namespace. How are we using it in relation to search? Is it more like we build this Elasticsearch namespace as a kind of and as an abstraction layer to interact with Elasticsearch? So in that case, it will be more like an infrastructure
Yeah, like
layer, or
integration.
or
Yeah,
or is like or is more like an adapter for search? So because I think there in
yeah.
that case it will be more like it will, in some cases, or maybe part of it could be under search, Elasticsearch, like let's say search namespace, and then Elasticsearch adapter, something like that.
Yeah.
Could be
Uh,
interpreted that way, or
For
could be
sure.
entirely, Elasticsearch is something we actually want to extract away from search. It's more like an infrastructure layer that can be used across different things, even outside of the search. In that case, we move it into more like an infrastructure layer, maybe under lib, and eventually, will be part of a platform, sort of infrastructure layer.
Yeah. It's really interesting because it's actually both like one of the things is it's at the moment it's only performing search, and you do have you want to think about it as an adapter. So we're busy replacing code search with another platform called Zooked, which
Mhm.
just does code search. So now you have multiple different integrations, but they're all doing search. Um, but also at the moment, we're looking at Elasticsearch for storing embeddings for AI stuff. So
Mhm.
now it becomes Elastic is actually an infrastructure that can serve the entire company, and it's not only for search. So yeah, it's really interesting to think about it.
Mm.
What did you do in that case? Just for an example.
Um, so so if we end up using now Elasticsearch for AI, are we going to reuse the existing code and that we have for the search?
Yes, for sure.
Okay, so so it feels like that there is part of it that requires more like to be extracted, to be more independent functionality. In that case, it becomes yeah, part of the infrastructure. So this is me
Some
just generalizing, like simplifying probably the approach, but like I would look at what is generic solution that can be extracted into Elasticsearch adapter or being
GitLab.
generic, and then having very specific adapter implementation for search
Yeah.
or for AI and other things, is that actually interact directly with that and have a sort of business logic, interpreter or parser, and how to to take data and send over to Elasticsearch or to query Elasticsearch for that specific use cases. But then
Yeah.
the generic part of Elasticsearch is moved to the infrastructure.
Yeah. So I agree with the approach of thinking about, well, that's how I've always thought about it. Lib is something that you can later extract into a package and deploy separately. It shouldn't talk to like directly with your models or anything like that. Is that kind of the pattern we're also aiming for here, or?
Yeah, so I think so currently we have this shared feature category, which I think eventually we have to figure out who owns
Mm,
this and how we define ownership. But what I'm thinking is that there is a lot of this infrastructure level code that sometimes might be uh, model concerns that we are shared across the multiple models. Sometimes could be like Elasticsearch infrastructure layer. Um, that I think so. First of all, it's important they are extracted. They're more defined what they are, and and then we can see, okay, what is the team that mainly works with Elasticsearch? Okay, this search team, even though Elasticsearch is used for multiple um, purposes, there is domain expertise in Elasticsearch in that team, so it makes sense that that team kind of drives more the design of that in the long term. Um, but I think the fact that it's then extracted, it's clear that we have other usage of it that is actually extracted. We are seeing similar scenarios with this like packages has like semver semantic versioning utility that was implemented in package, but now is being used across different types of the application. But if you look at the code, different parts of the application are referencing packages, column, semver, which is it's not great, but it looks like it, asks for being extracted and to be a more like independent feature. Uh, and see, it's kind of a similar scenario. So it was something implemented originally for to solve a very specific purpose of within a feature category, but it became a more generalized solution. And I think we should be doing that as well with in that case.
cool. And just in general, how many namespaces, like the second column we added, how many namespaces are you thinking, like ballpark figures? Is it going to be way less than the feature categories or more, or like?
Mm. I don't have a really like a very detailed answer on this, but like in the Slack channel yesterday, actually, I this Gabriel had the same question, and he said, so well, like what are we in terms of numbers? So I would say like if we start from a feature category as a starting point, and then we break down into multiple namespaces where it makes sense or join them together. I would say roughly will be around that number. Now, currently we have like about 50 feature categories that we have used in the spreadsheet. So I would say maybe 50 or maybe 40 around that number. Yeah, might be more the case. I think this is not considering, though. I might be wrong actually from this perspective. When we look at domain bounded context, I think should be similar, like 50, 40. But I think there's a separate case for utilities or infrastructure level code, because I think under lib we have a lot of multiple cross-cutting concerns, and each of them might have its own top level namespace. I'm thinking about like Markdown and all the various kind of utility, even like Elasticsearch could be like its own like infrastructure level utility, and so those will be translated into Ruby namespaces, but they're not necessarily bounded context.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, Raj?
Yeah, so while I was thinking through all the conversation, I realized, I remembered that there are a lot of namespaces which were a lot of models which were originally added, which do not have any namespace attached. So moving them to the right namespace would be part of this activity itself.
No, I think we will not make any code changes in part of this activity. We are more figuring out what can be the strategy on the long term. Yeah, and have this kind of discussions like where would project be, like how what kind of bounded context will that become, and like which team will primarily own that. It doesn't mean everyone of course can always contribute, but a team might be better suited for driving the direction in the long term. So we're not going to make any code changes right now, but the idea is like, okay, let's come up with a list that we can eventually start, it makes sense to start enforcing.
But in the Excel, we will have some future namespace in which project would lie, or namespace would lie, the model namespace.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, for example, I'm thinking about like organizations, which is a new table we introduced. For me, that makes sense to be owned by something like cells, because they really care about how it's structured and the direction of what this organization is going to look like in the future. So like if you think about projects or groups, maybe that also makes sense. But yeah, it's really tough.
Yes. I think what it makes difficult to categorize these models is the fact that they are overloaded with responsibilities. So it's easy to say they're just shared responsibilities because, but I think if we could, in theory, distill this down to being containers or identities, like a user would be like a user identity with no business related information aside from the user lifecycle, creation and deletion or blocking users, things like that. Then we could say it might be a lot easier to say, okay, this is just a single responsibility that this model has. It's a shared ID kind of across multiple things. And the same will be the project. Project and groups might become containers of features. But it's itself, they will only contain their own kind of life cycle behavior, but not like yeah, even if we think about project settings, I think even project settings is also overloaded with responsibilities because there are settings about everything. So ideally, it would be good to have, I don't know, merge request project settings or repository project settings. So think where the project ID is used just as an identifier, but then that bounded context manages the settings for that project. It's not the project itself, but it's just the project is used as a container. Yeah, in that case, will make it easier to actually define ownership there.
Did that answer what your thoughts were, Suraj?
Yes. Thank you.
Cool. So we're about a time, and yeah, how would we feel to continue the exercise with the bounded context? Does it make sense to look like at the Rumi namespaces?
Yeah, makes sense. Maybe just for making it a little bit easier, can you give some examples of Ruby namespaces? I see we have CI merge requests. Can we add search as one?
Yeah, packages, repository. I don't know. We want to use repository. We want to use Git, for example. Geo could be another namespace. What might become a bit more, I think most of this, like, there's a lot of code that's already well namespaced. I'm looking like, for example, packages or, but there is some other parts that are a little bit more, either the name doesn't match the feature category. We doesn't necessarily have to be that way. I think ultimately we don't want to be too strict because things might still change over time, but we want to have some kind of one-on-one relationship, even if with a slightly different name, as long as we can say things that are related together are within the same namespace. We have some scenarios, I think, with security. There's some cases where we're actually using multiple namespaces for the same thing. I think it's like security orchestration, something like that, and we might use and then secure something else. So they kind of similar things that are somehow related, but we should combine the namespace. Yeah, generally to understand, okay, at this part, the same thing. So another thing would be clusters. Yeah, integrations. This could be some of the examples that I can think of. Like,
Thank you. Yeah, that helps a lot.
yeah, I think we can use primarily what already exists there, but we can make sure that things that then we realize they are related, they somehow are either merged into the same namespace. Yes, Suraj?
Yeah, so I was wondering, so there's a case, there's a namespace which we have within utilization, which is currently part of the namespace, and it deals with storage related stuff, but it specifically deals with storage enforcement for the namespace. Now, right now, it makes sense to me that it is within that namespace because the categorization there makes it evident that we are talking about storage enforcement of namespaces. But utilization or fulfillment owns that part of the namespace. But majority of the namespace would be owned by some other team. How would we go about separating this while still keeping it clear as it is right now?
So yeah, so could it be that I don't know what namespace we have for utilization, but like, do we have some kind of utilization namespace, and then we have
Most utilization namespaces relate to subscription management or plan management. So, because that's what the primary responsibility, that's where the primary responsibility lies, licenses and stuff like that. But when we talk about the utilization team within fulfillment, we work with a lot of cross-cutting
Mhm.
places with a lot of stages. So the enforcement part specifically sits with a lot of different stages or lots of common elements, and the storage being related directly to the utilization
Yes,
is one example where I could see. Maybe I'll have to check, but I think CI minutes or something like that could
as well.
also
Okay.
have some overlap like that. But it does not primarily really come under the hard defined boundaries of utilization of fulfillment, which are mostly subscription related.
Mhm. Yeah, it's I can see that, like, you, first of all, I think that we might not want to have code that is related to utilization that is like a namespace under namespace, whatever namespace level utilization, or projects will be artifacts, usage, whatever, spread across multiple namespaces. First of all, like, since utilization is a very specific concern and has very specific use cases, it makes sense to be like in its own namespace. So we can say utilization, namespace statistics, or project statistics, or you can have whatever enforcement services, service objects, and things like that. Even though they use data from other models, I think it's what we want to design is around use cases and not data. So I think what we are doing in that case is we are designing around data. Say, okay, the data is namespace, so I just namespace under namespace. So we have this guideline now that to design code around use cases, which is more in line with bounded context and namespacing things correctly.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you all. That was really productive. And let's catch up, I think, on the making next progress. Thank you all. Have a good rest of your day.